Okay, so the webinar has started.
Oh, welcome, Miss Tannis. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome.
Welcome.
Hi, Trisha. How are you?
I am good. Sorry, I'm just twiggling with my technology, but I'm fine.
That's
Okay,
all
so
right.
we have attendees joining now.
Yeah.
So it's not only us.
Okay.
Aha, much
Welcome,
better.
everyone. We are going to get started, even if people are still filing in, because we want to respect everyone's time. And just to remind you that the video will be available on the SRC's website as well as on our social media for those who didn't manage to make it or couldn't make it for the entirety of the webinar. Good afternoon. My name is Janive Remy. I am the director at the Sridath Rampal Center for International Trade Law, Policy and Services. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to this, our webinar, the final one in the series where we look at various elements of US CARICOM engagement, especially in the context of trade and investment and opening up relations, extending them, deepening them, widening them in new ways. We have been holding a series of these webinars throughout the year, thanks to the very kind sponsorship and support of the US Embassy in Bridgetown. And those of you who have been following our webinars will know that we had for each of them a brief concept paper or briefing paper. We looked at issues such as entities in the US that trade with the US, with the Caribbean. We looked also at some aspects of the private sector engagement with the Caribbean. And we also had the fortune of looking at issues such as the climate change dimension in the context of an ASIL webinar. And so we're really, really happy that for this webinar, we're going to go in much deeper because we've commissioned for this series, for this particular aspects of the series, a Caribbean expert based in the United States and who has done a lot of work in the US as well as out of Jamaica, Ms. Andrea Ewart, to look really in depth at some of the issues that the private sector in the Caribbean is confronting and how we may be able to use the existing architecture of trade agreements and also other related agreements to advance that relationship. So it's really my pleasure to welcome our esteemed panelists from the private sector in the Caribbean, and also Ms. Ewart, who has done the bulk of the work in terms of her presentation of her findings through a report that is available on our website. It is my distinct pleasure to hand over the remainder of the the remainder of the webinar to you in the capable hands of my colleague, Ms. Alicia Nichols, who is our trade researcher at the SRC. So over to you, Alicia, and enjoy this webinar. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Jan. And good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you joining us for this afternoon's SRC Lunchtime Chat. My name is Alicia Nichols, Junior Research Fellow with the SRC, and it's my pleasure to moderate this afternoon's session with a very esteemed panel. I am pleased to welcome, of course, Ms. Andrea Ewart, who, as my director indicated, is the international trade attorney and founder of Developed Trade Law in Washington, D.C., and who was the consultant and author of this SRC Commission paper, U.S. CARICOM Trade and Investment Relations, Increasing the Participation of the Caribbean Private Sector in Caribbean-U.S. Engagements. And during this session, Ms. Ewart will present her findings and recommendations, followed by a private sector roundtable discussion, where she'll be joined with several distinguished representatives of the regional private sector. And I'm pleased to welcome them, Mrs. Vashti Goyadeen, CEO of the Trinidad and Tobago Coalition of Services Industries, Mrs. Trisha Tanis, Chairman, Barbados Private Sector Association, Mr. Nirad Tiwari, CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce of Trinidad and Tobago, and Mr. Gordon Charles, President of the OECS Business Council and CEO of JQ Charles Group of Companies Limited. As you know, the US is the major trading partner for the region, and for some countries like Barbados, it's our major trading partner. So I do hope that you would enjoy today's session, and Ms. Ewart now is going to give her findings based on the paper that she would have produced for us, and then we'll have the discussion afterwards. Should you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A session or in the chat below. And I'll hand over now to Andrea, who will present her findings.
All right. Thanks very much, Alicia. My thanks to the Sridhar Ramphal Center, as well as the U.S. Embassy to Barbados for giving me the opportunity to delve into this topic, and for the opportunity this afternoon to share my findings. I have a lot to say and not a lot of time, so I'm gonna just delve into it, and I may be rushing over a few things, but I hope there will be an opportunity to explore in the discussion that follows. So the research paper had the following goals: to identify the major barriers facing Caribbean firms when exporting to the US and propose solutions to those barriers, highlight existing mechanisms and arrangements for Caribbean US private sector engagement, and propose concrete and implementable recommendations for increasing Caribbean private sector advocacy and engagement in the context of Caribbean US trade and investment relations. And in our findings, these issues are interconnected in that the effective use of mechanisms for private sector engagement are integral to effective implementation of the recommendations that we proposed to address the identified barriers. The paper focuses on the 12 English-speaking independent member states of CARICOM. There are some references to Haiti for comparative purposes in the context of the Caribbean Basin Initiative Trade Preference Program, or CBI, which is the primary framework for US Caribbean trading relations. Some brief background for context. CBI excludes the Dominican Republic, which is not a CARICOM member state, but has its own separate FTA with Central American countries, along with Central American partners. Suriname is not a CBI beneficiary, though it is a CARICOM member state. Aruba, British Virgin Islands, and Curacao are CBI beneficiaries, but neither fully independent nor are they CARICOM members. So this gives some idea of the challenge of doing regional analysis on trade. What do you mean when you say the Caribbean, and which countries are included in any given data set? And so for this reason, and also to be able to explore perceptions held by the private sector, the consultations with the private sector business support organizations around the region were a rich source of data. And my thanks to Nirad and to Vashti, with whom I spoke. There are limitations there, of course, because I did not contact everyone. The other two panelists were not contacted, and not everyone to whom I reached out did accept the invitation to participate. And then there is a certain anecdotal nature to the information that's gained. Nevertheless, I think the information provided very important nuances, as you will see. So in the interest of time, I'll go on now to share the key findings. And I will note that in each area, I make one or two priority recommendations. And then in identifying mechanisms for private sector engagement, I focused on existing mechanisms rather than attempting to propose or create new ones. So key findings on barriers to goods and services exports and on FDI. With respect to goods trade, the CBI, which provides access to the US market for thousands of products, is underutilized. Why is this? While the literature takes note of supply side constraints, small market shipping costs, etc., limited access to finance, and as well as the need to meet the phytosanitary requirements for goods. You need to wash mangoes in hot water going to the US, for instance. But with respect to those SPS issues, in conversations with the relevant BSOs provided a much more nuanced picture. Caribbean exporters are less deterred by the challenge of meeting the technical requirements for goods to enter the US, and instead express frustration with the apparent ad hoc enforcement and often changing US rules, some of which are driven by protectionism. A good example of that, what's operating right now, are the rules for the catfish market, which are aimed at stopping the dominance of Vietnamese fish in the US market, but has also negatively impacted Guyana's exports. The Jamaica Manufacturers and Exporters Association gave the example of a Jamaican company, an experienced exporter. It exports over 90% of its products, but just being subjected out of the blue to some random request for documentation, which it had not previously had to provide. And these kinds of requests, off-the-cuff requests, can be time-consuming, expensive, and sometimes may even require technical services that are not available in country. And then another challenge is varying requirements at different ports. You can ship citrus to Baltimore, but not to Florida, for example. A second challenge identified by the BSOs is the complexity of the US market, which, as one of them noted, is actually a multiplicity of markets. So rather than spending money on trying to penetrate the mainstream US market, understand the market, do market research, etc., many focus on exporting to the large diaspora population, which is already familiar with their products. And of course, this reality would be one factor that explains the underutilization of CBI, that is a relatively narrow range of products that are imported into the US in reliance on the Caribbean Basin Initiative benefits. Then a third challenge is a challenge that companies face in getting information on how to actually access the US market. This includes information about the very existence of CBI. There's about 30% of products that would be eligible to access or to claim CBI benefits on entering the US market do not do so, to their detriment. So lack of information on how to use the information, how to use the program, and then information on the requirements to get a specific product into the US. How do you even find out that information? Where do you get a certificate of origin, and what are the requirements to do so? This is clearly a failing on the part of the national agencies responsible for issuing these certificates of origin. The Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Industry and Commerce reported that recently a member was interested in exporting a CBI eligible product, but getting the information on what was required to get the certificate of origin took so much time that it was almost a deterrent. And one cannot help but wonder how many other companies might be, or potential exporters might be, deterred. So with respect to trade in goods, our priority recommendation was to address this information gap. And we proposed two key activities as priority recommendations: ongoing education to increase private sector awareness of CBI and how to use it. And secondly, creation of an information portal that contained the information specific to the needs of importers from the Caribbean, including product-specific entry requirements. And a good starting point would be the products that we know are in high demand in the US diaspora market. Moving on to services trade, I want to note the work of TTCSI in collecting data on services, because the lack of that data complicates analysis. And then a number of barriers were highlighted, but I'm keeping an eye on my time. So let me go to my priority barrier and recommendation. The lack of portability of the certification of professionals was a primary barrier that we recommended for priority consideration. And in conversation with TTCSI, the dilemma that faces makeup artists who have the opportunity to travel with entertainers to the US or to serve US-based clients was highlighted. Many are unable to do so because they are not certified in the US as makeup artists, and that is a requirement by 41 of the 50 US states. That's a time-consuming process, requiring on average about 134 days of training and the sitting and passing of 2 exams. And so learning more about this issue, studying more of such examples, and then finding ways to address them through negotiating agreements, mutual recognition agreements, which recognize the existing professional requirements without compromising US standards, is our priority recommendation with respect to services trade. And then on foreign direct investment, even before the pandemic, FDI inflows into the region were falling, and FDI is a primary recipient of any of FDI coming into the region. But again, let me move on to focus here. Lack of knowledge about the large and complex US market is a challenge. And conversations with BSOs, some of them revealed a desire to attract partners and investors with whom they could explore and develop opportunities to address regional challenges and provide nearshoring alternatives for the US. Renewable energy projects to wean countries off of their expensive reliance on fossil fuels was one example. Issues looking at food security, non-traditional financing were other suggested areas, and there were others. So moving on to the mechanisms for private sector engagement, I focused on 2 existing mechanisms. The first that I want to highlight is the US CARICOM Trade and Investment Council, or the TIC. The TIC was created by the US CARICOM Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, or TIFA, of 2013, and there was an earlier one in 2009 that has kind of fallen along by the wayside. And the TIFA calls for annual meetings in the form of the TIC of US and CARICOM partners to discuss trade and investment challenges and opportunities. In August, the lunchtime chat highlighted the successes that Uruguay had been able to achieve through its own use of similar mechanisms, incorporating private sector engagement. For the Caribbean, the challenge is, how can the private sector organize itself to intervene in a state-led initiative that has not effectively defined a role for it? And I don't have time to explore the reasons that they may or may not be, so I'll leave that for another discussion. But to some of the suggestions, the Caribbean Private Sector Organization, which is a CARICOM entity charged with focusing on the CSME, could nevertheless be charged with placing the question of private sector engagement in the TIC onto the agenda of quoted meetings. Perhaps regional entities such as the Caribbean Chambers of Commerce and Caribbean Manufacturers Association, Caribbean Coalition of Service Industries could take the lead in facilitating consultations with the region's private sector in advance of TIC meetings, or maybe you create an ad hoc committee. The point is, however this is done, the idea is to identify concrete solutions to specific challenges faced by the private sector that could be explored and further developed in the context of TIC meetings. And we propose as a starting point, going back full circle, the priority recommendations that we mentioned earlier, creating of the information portal, use of technical groups to address some of the SPS challenges, to explore the issue of portability of professional qualifications. Now, does the private sector actually participate in some portion of the TIC meetings or the technical working groups? Or does it have a separate meeting on the side that feeds recommendations into the TIC meetings? These are questions to be explored. What is important, we believe, is recognizing that the work of identifying the concrete needs of the region's private sector is an essential part of shaping a focused and concrete CARICOM agenda for TIC meetings. Moving on briefly to the second existing mechanism, that's the Americas Business Dialogue, which acts as a private sector consultation mechanism for the Summit of the Americas. I think folks know what that is. We've had a lot of attention put on it this week. The ABD is the vehicle through which the private sector provides input into the summit process. It has over 400 business support organizations and companies from all across the Americas. And at least on paper, at least one BSO from all of the CARICOM countries are listed as ABD members. We believe the value of engaging in the ABD network extends beyond providing input into the Summit of Americas. First, you can become active. Sorry, I'm canceling my time. Becoming active in the ABD network can facilitate the search for the investment partnerships. Secondly, it can help in improving the understanding by the region's BSOs about US government operations and identifying relevant agencies with which to connect. And thirdly, ABD's work is facilitated by the Inter-American Development Bank, emphasis on the word bank, which has money, right, to facilitate access, to provide, and could be a source of funding for events, as well as to address some of the technical constraints discussed earlier. So in sum, I think I'm a little over time, we have proposed actions we believe that where the region's private sector can play a leadership in advocating for its interests and in advancing trade and investment relations with the United States. So let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for giving us a lot of food for thought, explaining the scope of your paper, what were your findings, and some recommendations. And before I get to our distinguished panel, I just wanted to acknowledge that CPC, the Caribbean Policy Consortium, have partnered with us with this US Caribbean program. And I wish to acknowledge Mr. David Lewis, who is here from CPC as well, a friend of the SRC. And welcome to all of you, because many of you we know are friends of the SRC. So I'm going to bring in our other panelists, who are all no strangers to many of you, distinguished representatives of the private sector. And panelists, Andrea noted that there are several business mechanisms like the TIC and the Americas Business Dialogue, but it seems as though there's not a lot of engagement, so to speak, or participation in these things. So how involved are your chambers currently in the US Caribbean trade discussions more generally, or business discussions more generally? Anyone?
Well,
Trisha, go ahead.
Morning, Alicia, the panelists, Gian and Yanives, and certainly all of our participants. Thank you so much for the invitation to the Private Sector Association of Barbados to contribute. I really was very intrigued by the the study that was done by Andrea, and essentially it struck certain truths as one made her way through the research in terms of the reality of what private sector associations certainly are confronted with across the Caribbean. I know that she said that she didn't have a chance to speak to all of us, but what was also very compelling is the fact that who she did get a chance to speak to across the region, the issues certainly ring true and are fairly homogenous, and it's remarkable that we're still, she's still covered with a high degree of accuracy, even the groups that she had not had a chance to speak to. I think it is certainly no secret that the trade imbalance between the two regions is phenomenal. I don't think you can even call it an imbalance. There's practically little to no substantive, domestic goods exports to the U.S. relative to the size of the economy, and certainly relative to where, to the imports from the U.S. I think, we're looking at $4 million. Certainly, even if you look at Barbados, $4 million essentially of trade, very paltry outwards. In contrast, we import about 65 million. So there's little or no comparison. To speak to the question as to how involved are we, she makes an excellent point, and we do wholeheartedly agree that we're certainly not involved. Certainly more so limited to the margins. She is absolutely accurate in that, we're brought on board at a fairly advanced stage of the dialogue and the conversation. And therefore, there's a sense that the wicket, as you would say in cricketing terms, has already, been set. But there is some hope. I do know the Chamber of Commerce in Barbados, has recently hosted a trade mission from South Carolina. I think that was actually very, very recent in October this year. It was organized by the Barbados Consul General in Miami, the Chamber, and also there was a tourism aspect to that tour as well, and also a diplomatic spin-off. And I think there is also, efforts to reciprocate to North Carolina, in the not too distant, future. So I would say that we are definitely not involved very early in the conversation. We do obviously leverage the information that we are able to get, but we very much are in agreement with the fact that governments certainly tend to control the state of play and the canvas, very much so from a diplomatic perspective in terms of their foreign affairs ministries across the Caribbean. We do observe, certainly from our perspective, that the private sector then is certainly given a canvas to paint on, as opposed to helping to carve that canvas. And I think that's what we're probably going to explore a lot more as we head into the panel discussion. So I'll pause there, Alicia. Thank you very much for the opportunity again.
And thank you very much, Tricia, especially for giving us your reactions to the paper. And I was just wondering if any other panelists wanted to give their reactions as well.
Sure, I will go next. What we at the TDCSI have been involved in, and Andrea pointed it out about the paucity of data, trading services data. So for the past 2 to 3 years, we have been heavily involved in conducting a number of studies. We recently completed a study earlier this year. It's a regional US market studies in collaboration with Manchester Trade. And at the local level, we completed 2 national services exporters survey. So what we have done is documented at a firm level in terms of which firms have been trying to enter the US market, what barriers they are facing, so that we know exactly how to design policies, how to negotiate on their behalf. So that is what we have been focused on, because we do not have reliable data on trade and services. Because Nirad, as the CEO of TDCSI, way back in 2013, he, in collaboration with David, launched Services of the Caribbean, and nothing happened after that. So we are focused on getting that data, and I can't stress how important that information is, because it's that data drivers to know what are the priority sectors, and we get the real life examples of who have been trying in what states and what have been their experience.
Thank you so much, Vashti. Anyone else wanted to give their reactions to the paper?
If I might just chime in and comment. First of all, I'd like to thank Andrea. I think the paper was very elucidating. It really did show and highlight the shortfalls that we are achieving here, especially when you compare us to the other regions where the direct comparison was, whether it's Guatemala or Ecuador, which I think are models that if we were to use the strategies and the structures that they went towards, maybe we can be a lot more effective in what we want. First of all, having to identify when you're trading with a strong partner, to, as Andrea pointed out, identify what you need on your side. You need to become prepared to be able to understand what exactly it is you need, so that when you sit with them, you can start that conversation. And we haven't done a good job. And I think further, in preparation for this event, I did reach out to at least two chambers in the sub-region. I'm here primarily as the OECS Business Council representative, but I also sit as an executive of the board of the CARICOM Private Sector Organization. So I will be speaking with two hats for the brunt of this conversation. The chambers have not been effective in at least the ones that I have had communication with, and they've said so. They have not been a part of it, and they've not been communicating with it. The whole concept of the CBI has been something that has not been a priority for them. They focused on national issues and not focused on regional issues. Secondly, you find that even in some of the smaller markets, it is not the job really of the chambers of commerce. It is more the manufacturing associations, because most of this ends up being focused in those regions on export, on manufactured export, and therefore you find it is those entities that focus more on trying to find these avenues to get into the States. While we do understand now that with the widening of opportunities, whether it's telecoms, IT, ICT, etc., there's so many other opportunities where you can trade and not necessarily via export. I will jump in here as well and say that the CPSO members, while we recognize that the chambers have not necessarily been effective, the CPSO who have been involved directly with trade and investment discussions and for in the US, as an institution, the CPSO has not formally extended its focus to the body of work attached to the strengthening, deepening, and building out of the US-Caribbean relationship. However, CPSO maintains partnerships for information exchange on the key development and has been identifying the areas on which an institutional relationship can be led by the CPSO, but with active participation by the regional private sector and by entities like AmCham and so on, that can yield the biggest dividend to the US-Caribbean trade and investment relations. And we are, I think, having been the formally accredited private sector body, apex private sector body for the entire region, the CPSO, as Andrea pointed out, should be one of the entities that takes the lead in creating a forum, first of all, for direct communication, because part of the problem is because we are so diverse and spread all over, you have 50 different people trying to go and achieve one thing. Whereas if you can come together and you have one entity being strong, speaking the language, being the negotiator, and then disseminating the information, whether it is, for example, the CPSO to the OECS Business Council, which then takes a responsibility for farming that information out within the OECS and down to in Trinidad and Barbados, the various entities there. It is so important that we speak as one collective voice, because without that, we will continue to be blowing in the wind.
Thank you so much, Gordon, for that very timely call to action for us as a region, our private sectors and our private sector associations to have a more united approach towards these things. And Nirad, your reactions to the paper.
So thank you, Alicia, and thanks to the SRC for inviting me to participate. I thought the paper is very useful, and congratulations to Andrea for the work that she's doing. I mean, the commitment that we're seeing to trying to gather some tangible data and recommendations and so on is very welcome. So let me just quickly say that AmCham is part of a network of 24 AmChams in this hemisphere, and together we form the Association of American Chambers of Latin America and the Caribbean, which is allied with the US Chamber of Commerce in DC. And so we tend to focus in that network on policy issues that would free up or make it easier to do business in the hemisphere. And so as we talk about this issue, it's of course multidimensional, but how welcome or welcoming our countries are to investment, how attractive they are, is a big part of the discussion, because finance money goes where it's welcome, right? Capital is deployed where it feels welcome. And as you have more US investment, you're likely to have more trade at other levels. I do think we're underutilizing the TIFA and therefore the TIC, but also we haven't explored the incentives under the CBI to the extent that we probably could have. On the issue of the MRAs, when we signed the EPA, a lot of resources went into MRAs, a lot of time, a lot of effort, and we thought for the architects, for the engineers, we would be opening up a lot of opportunities. The reality is MRAs are not very easy to negotiate, and therefore one might consider where you'd get the best bang for your buck, or turn those into opportunities, meaning for the states that do require licenses, and Florida, for example, has just done away with licenses for makeup artists. But for the states that do require licensing, an entity such as the TTCSI, which is engaged in that space, might be able to offer some level of certification training as a revenue generator and as an enabler to overcome that barrier, to the extent that it is a barrier and there is demand. And so the work that Vashti is referring to, getting some primary research at the firm level, will also be useful. So I think ultimately, though, we need to, if we are to use the TIC more effectively, we, the private sector, need to define what it is we want the TIC to do for us, and therefore what we're asking of the government. So it's one thing to call for the convening of the TIC, but then if it's done, what do we want to say? What do we want to discuss? And I think both at the government level and at the private sector level, we may not have done a good enough job in defining our interests, either for the TIFA councils or for the TIC. And so we feel that to some extent, the discussions at the intergovernmental level will happen, and we need to participate and influence and collaborate to do so, because we AmCham won't be doing that, say, at the CARICOM level. We'd be doing it in collaboration with the other chambers or through discussions that we have with individual ministers. And so we're focused on the vertical of technology, and also looking at what markets we think would be attractive. The one thing I'd put on the table is that we've traditionally looked, as Andrea said in the paper, to the diaspora markets, but each sub-region is almost its own little economy. So Chicago as a hub for the Midwest, for example, Atlanta's feeling that it's always competing with Miami and may in fact be not receiving as much credit as it should. What's happening in Texas and so on. We aren't tapping into the potential that is available in the other markets. And then of course there's the whole issue of connectivity to the islands, air connectivity in particular. And now we're facing supply chain issues in Trinidad and Tobago. Manufacturers can't get containers, empty containers. into which to put goods to ship it out. So we're sort of in a confluence, but there are opportunities with the whole ESG conversation and the need to green everything, as well as the overall need of the geopolitical needs of the US to pay more attention to this hemisphere. And with the supply chain disruptions, the push toward nearshoring at the firm level. So when those three things come together, there's a lot of opportunity now for us. And I think some companies are already starting to take advantage of that. And to the extent that we in the chambers need to pay more attention to it and collaborate, I guess we should be doing so.
Thank you so much, Nirad. And before I get to Andrea for her reactions to your comments, I wanted to mention the fact that this, a lot of the things that you've mentioned shows that maybe there is a greater need for private sector and a more unified private sector approach and participation in some of these mechanisms for engagement between the US and the Caribbean countries. And Andrea, I will go to you now for your reaction, and then we'll discuss some of the other things that some of the panelists had touched on as well, a bit deeper.
Okay, thanks, Alicia. And thanks very much for the feedback. Again, I have to commend the frankness and the depth of the exchanges with those BSO representatives with whom I did speak that allowed me to capture such a comprehensive picture of what's going across the region. And Tricia, thank you very much for those comments as well. I think I'll address two issues. One has to do with the just the MRAs, negotiating the MRAs. I was actually involved in doing some preparatory work to help negotiate the MRAs under the EPA for engineers, I think, and yes, very, very complex. I think there are some differences that could make with respect to the US market, because in the context of the EU, it was both about accessing the market and about, trying to understand this, a very complex scheme, so to speak, or system that was in place for the licensing, etc., across the whole of Europe for engineers and architects. And I think we're talking about, especially in the context of, say, makeup artists, I think we'd be talking about something that's more achievable and more tangible. So I just want to make that note, especially because the markets are already established. Whereas I think in the question with respect to the EU, there were two kind of sets of issues going on simultaneously. So, and then in terms of, I just want to come back to the purpose of the paper, because yes, Nirad did and Gordon, lots of issues, right? Lots of problems. And I think that it's very easy to get overwhelmed if we try to focus on everything. And so I think that's why the paper attempted to identify, coming out of the data that we received, some priority goals and recommendations for specifically for US engagement in the context of the TIC. And then I would be interested in feedback on, the idea of getting involved in the America's Business dialogue, because I didn't, and I know Nirad, that's something with which you're already familiar and engaged in. But I think even if that was put on, moved off of the priority list, I think focusing on some of the refining, expanding on some of the recommendations that are in this paper can be very, very useful and instrumental in shaping that agenda that Nirad identified is needed for the private sector to begin to engage in the context of the TIC process. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for that. I need just to note that we have a very vibrant discussion going on in the Q&A as well, and we'll get to you guys shortly. But it's a very good discussion going on in the Q&A. And I also wanted to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Keith Nurse, former SRC Director. Welcome, Dr. Nurse. So in terms now, so we talked a bit about the fact that there's a need for more private sector participation in terms of some of these mechanisms. And they've been, and it was mentioned a bit earlier, there've been many attempts, valiant attempts. Some of you here, like David and others, will be aware, you know, I would have been part of these valiant attempts over the years to deepen this private sector engagement. So why do you think that they have not really come to fruition? Why do you think that despite all of this great work, some of these great minds that have been working towards trying to deepen the relationship between the US and the Caribbean, particularly with regard to trade and investment, why is it we think that some of these initiatives might have fizzled out, so to speak, initiatives that would have started many years ago in many instances? Andrea, and then I would let the other panelists jump in as well.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, I was, you know, my mind has been wrestling with that issue. One, I think that I don't know that a representative enough sample of the Caribbean private sector has been engaged in these efforts. When I looked, for instance, at you know, who was involved in the Caribbean American Central Action, I think I got the name right, Caribbean Central American Action, you know, large corporations, of course, they have to be involved. But I think that there is always an opportunity, or that is important to keep trying. And I think that one, it's important to learn more about what was done before and what failed, so that we don't keep trying to do the same thing, because if it didn't work the last time, it's probably not going to work this time again. And I think broader engagement with more of the private sector, the business support organizations around the region is important, and to do more of a listening exercise, because again, when I look at the literature, there was some disconnect between, disconnect may be the wrong word. I think I learned a lot from actually listening to what was coming out of the private sector. And I think that more of that work needs to be done to understand, you know, what their needs are. And then if people have not been familiar with the CBI, have not been paying attention, don't know what the benefits are, don't know what they can get from it, then, you know, there's not a lot of reasons to engage. So I think getting back to the education piece is very, very important as a starting point.
That's a great point that you raised, several great points that you raised, Andrea. And I know you, for instance, have been involved in terms of training to build capacity of persons to be able to take advantage of the benefits under the CBI. And I'm wondering from our other panelists who are, you know, your leaders of your various private sector institutions, you know, what is it? I know Gordon mentioned in terms of the focus on national issues, you know, issues of national importance, immediate importance to you guys, but is it also other things like capacity? Is it that there's a need for more training and more technical assistance? I was wondering your thoughts, if I could go to Tricia, in terms of what is needed in order to get greater private sector participation in some of these initiatives that are already established. I think you're still muted, Tricia.
Sorry.
That's
Thank
fine.
you. Thanks. No, I think it goes back to the comment that was made earlier. And I think the comment that was made in terms of we really cannot be passive as a private sector, Caribbean private sector organizations. Nature abhors the vacuum. And I believe that what we're seeing and the way it has played out across the region is that, the various governments and so on are going to fill that vacuum with what they think the private sector needs, or what they think is going to contribute to the economic development of their own countries. And let's also call a spade, the politicizing of what those opportunities look like, given the particular brand of politics that we have in the region, also weighs very heavily on what diplomatic ties are pursued. I think the first thing that is needed, I think Narad was the one that actually raised this, is what do we want as a private sector in the Caribbean? What is it that we want? Can we articulate a common position, across all of the various private sector entities? The CPSO is a fairly young organization. But there are several older legacy organizations that certainly have the resources and the reach and the network to be able to at least start to articulate, what we said. No, in terms of having the tick on whether or not CPSO is the arm that we want to use because it already exists. It makes sense. It is a Caribbean private sector arm. It's now developing its mandate. It's now kind of settling itself and getting its own, resources. It's at a particular growth point that is very prime, I think, to put this on the agenda as one of their primary issues. I think that's one of the things that we do need. But I think it is very fundamental. I believe that we, as business people, we are not unfamiliar with the fact that we have to look at the opportunities that we want, and we certainly cannot sit down and ask our respective governments to do that for us. So I believe a great starting point would be first identify what is the structure above the various BSOs that we're going to follow this through. Can we get CARICOM support that this is something that the CPSO as perhaps the best placed entity to have this conversation, to have on their agenda, to fund, not just put it on the agenda, but to fund the agenda from CARICOM, which is an issue that they may have in terms of their secretariat support and the resources that they need, then to essentially lock into all of the BSOs across the region, to say, look, this is what we know, this is what we need, this is the information that we know is available to us. Yes, these are the barriers, these are the things the hurdles that need to be pushed. And therefore, this is how we need to really go to CARICOM and the heads and to say, look, in the diplomatic conversations, all right, in the summits of the Americas, in those various spaces, all right, we need to move these three things, all right? Very much informed by what Andrea has said, but that she hasn't unearthed all, but she's certainly unearthed enough, enough that we can have a conversation, because they are real. They are definitely real. But they have to be moved towards a goal. And I think that's where we've fallen down. We have not been able to clearly articulate what is it that we want. And our governments essentially, you really can't be blamed for filling that void for us. We don't need to be in that position as a private sector, because then we will always be off the table, on the table too late in the conversation. And it's about time that we create the table, right? And that we go to the government, we go to CARICOM, and we say, these are the opportunities that we have unearthed in these various initiatives, in the TIFAs, in the TRIAs, all the various spaces that we already have heavily negotiated. And these are the opportunities that we want for you to move for us, because we are standing ready with our capital. We have attracted our foreign direct investment, and we just need for you to move these hurdles so we can capitalize on these opportunities. The conversation, unfortunately, has been in the reverse. Okay, and I think it is simply a case where we have to take control of our own conversation. Alicia, I'll rest there.
Thank you so much, Trisha. And that's another important, powerful point, and feeds from what Gordon was saying as well. The fact is that there's a need to articulate what is it that you actually want, and Nira was saying, but I think that it has to be informed by data. And Vashti, I want to bring you in on this point, because I know your TTCSA has been doing a lot in terms of trying to get the data to help inform what you're doing. So I wanted you to speak a little bit more on that, also in terms of the opportunities, because we're speaking a lot about the challenges, but one of the things that we really want to get away with from this webinar is also some of the opportunities as well. So what has your data shown you in terms of the opportunities and some of the challenges for exporters from the Caribbean in the US market?
Sure, but Alicia, before I answer that question, I want to go back to the whole issue about how we look at services. The issue, the
Certainly.
challenge for services is that we are not organized.
I'm not too sure if it's my computer or.
No, I'm hearing
Okay.
you, so I think she's the one who's frozen. Oh, there she
Oh,
is now.
Okay,
Okay.
Vashi, thanks so much. Vashi, you were frozen a little bit just now, so I'll need you, if you could, please just repeat. Mhm.
Sure. Before I answer the whole issue of data, I want to focus a little bit on in terms of how services is organized in the region. So going back to 2004, when the heads of government of CARICOM took a decision to establish Coalition of Services Industries, being a singular vehicle to negotiate on behalf of services in the region. So from 2004 to 2008, 14 CSIs were created. Fast forward to 2022, we just have roughly 6 active CSIs. And we are all constrained financially. So the issue is that if you need to organize services, and again, taking the learnings from the manufacturers, we need to strengthen the vehicle that is representing these organizations. So we need to build capacity. So this is where TTCSI focus on core areas in terms of what our strength. It's to build the research, the trade and services capacity. And it's only when we analyze that data that we could build a case for what we should go after. And the intention is to help other CSIs along the way. So whatever we are doing it for our regional sisters, because all of these CSIs are led by female CEOs thus far. So in terms of going back to the study that was completed earlier this year, February 2022, we looked at a number of sectors and again a survey. So we conducted a survey with regional participants, and we draw from 2018 to roughly 2021, under the Economic Partnership Agreement, Caribbean Export secured funding for a training program called Services Go Global. So between 2019 to 2022, TTCSI, in collaboration with Caribbean Export, trained roughly 350 persons regionally in this program. So this was the sample that we use to determine where their needs are, what markets they are looking into. So from that survey, we identified that there were roughly 7 to 9 sectors that were priority sectors for services providers. And those are cultural and creative industries, business and BPOs. This is for the more mature industries, medical, health and wellness, tourism, educational services, and more so since 2020, the establishment of virtual centers of excellence, energy services, more so alternative energy, renewable energy, logistics, shipping, sport, and financial services. But coming out of medical and health and wellness, we have a number of subsectors under that. Spas, we have also beauty, personal care included in that.
Thank you so much, Vashti. I mean, and that's so interesting because, well, 2 things I want to react to, and then I'll get the other panelists to react. But one, you have to give us what was your formula for getting people to do surveys, because you know, a lot of people do not make the connection between the data that they want and the surveys that we are kindly asking them to fill out. So it would be good if you could give us some tips on that, you know, how you were able to get a good response rate with regards to your surveys. Secondly, I like the fact that you're talking about, and this is way forward, like this are so important in terms of sharing best practices, because you know the approach that you took is an approach that, as you say, you know, you're working with other coalitions of services industries in order to, you know, work on. And these are things that maybe some of the other BSOs as well, if they're not already doing it, these are approaches that they could take. So I guess maybe if there was a forum, maybe, you know, through CPSO or whatnot, a forum for some best practices learning or those sorts of things, in terms of how, in order to say, okay, this is what we are interested in, these are promising sectors, and therefore this is our ask, I think that could be useful.
Sure. And I'm always willing to share the formula to get a high participation rate for surveys.
Perfect, perfect.
Keep
And,
it to 10 questions, ensure that it's digital. And make sure that you, whenever the findings, you share the findings with the participants, because it has to focus on what's in it for the firm, for the participants. What's in it for them?
Exactly. Thank you so much, Vashti, for sharing with us. And my director is reminding me that we did a survey with CEDA, the SRC did, and we also had a high response rate as well. So lots of learning and kudos to go around. So, okay, so with regard now to some of the other issues, because I realize that we're coming up close to our time and we still want to be able to open up to Q&A, but so Vashti talked about some of the interesting issues in terms of services, and I'm interested to hear from some of the other panelists, what are some of the promising sectors that you think would be useful in terms of you know, increasing trade between our two regions. And Gordon, I'll come to you for the OECS perspective. What do you think are some of those promising sectors?
Well, the list that I have would include, but not limited to, nearshoring, which has tremendous opportunity if we urgently put the accompanying measures and regulations in place. Business practice outsourcing, ICT, maritime services, cultural and creative industries, fintech services, tourism and travel related services. And I want to stick a pin here where I had a conversation with a young gentleman earlier this week, and just totally coincidental, he came to me because he's in the process of trying to buy a hotel, to take over the running of a hotel and turn it into a training facility, because he told me since 2016, he has sent over 7,000 mainly solutions onto the ships, the tourism ships that come here, in terms of training them and getting up to the standard where they get jobs and employment. Now, I consider that trade with the US, because all these, whether it's trying to remember the names of the big tourism cruise lines, they're all based in Florida. And he has been able to get over 7,000 people over the last couple of years on these vessels every year on an ongoing basis. And now we're trying to expand it by creating a formal training center and facility in St. Lucia, which can accommodate both physically and also virtually training for other people and get them on. So that's an example of tourism and tourism-related services, which I think can grow. Professional services, obviously, health and wellness, medical tourism, and energy. Those are the bigger areas that I think that we can see opportunities growing. In terms of goods, you know, fish and crustaceans, they're available in the region, the sub-region. Upscaling of existing manufacturing, spices, condiments, tremendous potential, turmeric, ginger, even mushrooms and stuff like items like that. Cocoa and cocoa preparations, and nutraceuticals and agri-based exports, essential oils, nutmeg, lemongrass, etc. These are the things that I think that we can do once we understand how to utilize CBI and how to navigate CBI, I should say, and get the best out of it. And I just want to stick another pin here in having had a conversation with another exporter who has been doing it, he said, for over 15 years. He started long ago, and he said he has absolutely no issues with trade in the US. He has been following the CBI, he's been benefiting from CBI for all this time. He's up to the point now where he has migrated to exporting a 40-foot container per month into the US. He said he's not with the diaspora anymore. He's cracked the market. He's in Walmart, and he's in other businesses all around the primarily Eastern Seaboard, but his distributors are having going out. This is someone who simply took the effort to understand what it requires, went through the hurdles, went through the steps, and has been able to create an absolute success. He's willing to talk about it. He's willing to share his experience, and he's also willing to. I almost opted out for him to come and speak instead of me today. He's also willing to act as a support and a lead to help other businesses come on board, because what he's saying is there is a way. It takes time, but it is a way, and he's running a very successful export regime into the US right now.
Well, that's really great to hear, Gordon. I mean, if you wouldn't mind sharing his details with us, offline, it would be good to. Yeah, thank you so much. It would be good to have him to speak because, I think that, and you are right, it does take an investment to actually sit down and understand. Andrea, I will bring you in here because this is something that you do, you advise persons on these things. Your thoughts on that?
Before Andrea steps in, just taking my prerogative here, Alicia, just to say to Gordon, we would love to hear that person's story, and we could even have a session that the SRC will offer how to crack the US market. So thanks for that, and please let us know. We would love to have him next year. Sorry.
I will certainly bring him in.
Alicia, could I also interrupt before Andrew responds?
Sure.
Could I add on to what Gordon said? Because I think we focus not on the export of goods and services, but a lot of our territories are quite small, and scope and scale is one of the biggest impediments. And I think one of the things that we need to start locking in, if it isn't already there, is the whole concept of capacity building, where if we constantly think of small islands trying to build capacity and send containers to the States, I don't know if we're going to optimize the expansion of the trade between the two regions. However, if we start thinking of manufacturing in the States, then we may have a different conversation, because then we take advantage of the cost differential, the cost of production, the cost of investment, access to, to markets and more localized knowledge in terms of where we manufacture. And I think that's where we have to get the conversation to as well. That is beyond goods and services. It has to be a capacity building, looking at manufacturing Caribbean goods under license and franchising in the States, right? So I just want to add that to what Gordon said.
Thank you so much, Trisha, and I'll react to Trisha's point after you, Andrea. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, no, what I want to say is to that, well, first of all, kudos to this successful exporter and his growth. And, when it comes on to goods trade, the details are in the specific good product, is it, manufactured or not? And what are the rules of origin to get it into, the US market, and particularly on, let's say, CBI, et cetera. So that's the first thing that I will say. So, and we do know that there are some of the larger companies, to Trisha's point, they have started manufacturing in the US, but again, there are certain rules that have to be met to ensure that it, once it's manufactured in the US, right, you're no longer talking about taking the benefiting from CBI, but the inputs have to benefit from CBI. So, I could definitely see something where if someone sets up something that's going to be drawing from across the region, right? The inputs into a manufacturing facility, that's certainly something that benefits the entire region. What comes to mind is the whole question of, in addition to capacity building, capital constraints, because we know that that is a big issue, a big limitation for the region as well. And Neeraj alluded to the impediments, I suppose, are some of the things that might be deterrents, act as deterrents for US capital seeking to invest in the region. And so I think that's another issue that needs to be addressed. Something that came out for me in the research was just how separate the AmChams are from the rest of the private sector across the region. There are other entities that didn't even know. They're like, okay, the AmCham, what is that? They had no idea that it exists, had no idea of its role. And I think that bridging that gap, having more interconnections to the extent it makes sense to everybody else, but looking from just this discussion about where we want to go as a region, I think further integration of the AmChams with their experience and with their networks and understanding of what it takes to attract capital, the capital that is needed to be able to grow and expand would be an important, would be important to achieve. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And on that point, I wanted to bring in Neeraj because he's the head of the of an AmCham, and it would be good to hear his reaction to the needs, as you see it, for greater integration of the AmChams with the general private sector in the countries in which you're operating. So Neeraj, over to you.
Yeah. So, all right, let me take that part first. In Trinidad and Tobago, I mean, we are pretty well integrated with the other private sector organizations. In fact, just 2 days ago, in collaboration with the TNT Manufacturers Association, the TNT Chamber, and the Energy Chamber, we made a major donation to an NGO providing relief because we've had some flooding in Trinidad and Tobago during the height of the COVID pandemic. With the TNT Chamber and with the support of the TTCSI, we ran a vaccination site to facilitate the private sector, but it was open to the public as well. And we did more than 23,000 vaccinations over the course of 2 months. So here we are in the DR, for example. The AmCham is one of the largest private sector organizations. In Guyana, the AmCham sits on the Private Sector Commission. It depends. The AmCham in the Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean, because it covers all of those countries. It was set up to cover all of those countries to take into account market size. Has not gotten to the growth stage that they would like, but I know they keep trying. So it really depends on what's happening in the market and how the organization itself is organized. And they play different roles in different markets, depending, of course, also on the interest of trade with the US and that kind of thing. I just want to sort of jump backwards, though, and to pick up on where Gordon left us. Let's remember that we're discussing this about enhancing trade between our region and the US. And if we're discussing enhancing trade, it means that there is trade that is happening. And what we want is more. It's not that nothing is happening. So when we look at, as you say, the big companies, the Grace Kennedys, you would look at in Trinidad, the Massey Groups, the KC Confectionery, many others, Matooks, Carib has a plant, for example. The Ansa Macal has a brewery that it owns in Florida. And it is licensing a lot of the flavors that have been developed there and now making those in the region. So what it bought was not just the physical plant, but a lot of the IP, because it was a sort of an small independent brewery. So there's a lot that's happening. So as we try to assess what we want, yes, we have to look at the smaller businesses, but we also have to learn from those who have already been successful and understand what they've done. So Gordon's example, how did this young man penetrate Walmart? Because that's no easy feat, right? You have to show consistency of quality and supply, right? And then your packaging and your ability to distribute and so on. So what worked? How did they do it? Therefore, what are the challenges we have to overcome? I do think widening our suite of financial products in the region is something we don't talk enough about. But equity financing and trade financing that is not linked to assets is really, really important. So not enough. In Jamaica, you're seeing a lot of it. And you're seeing a blossoming of what I guess we could still call in the rest of the Caribbean non-traditional financial markets. So private equity, some level of venture capital that is helping. And then looking at where you have US entities. So again, saying that we're enhancing, we're not starting from zero. Just as we talk about trying to get into a Walmart, using a PriceSmart and using our constraints, the same things that I spoke about that have a dampening effect on investment. So in Trinidad and Tobago, for example, and Barbados, accessing foreign exchange is a challenge. So when you have an entity that is a foreign entity that is set up here, they want to repatriate profits. And if they can't turn their local earnings into hard currency to repatriate profits, it's a challenge. But in that is also an opportunity, because it means they want to spend more of the local currency rather than less. So an entity such as a PriceSmart, for example, I'm not sure if you have PriceSmart in Barbados, but I know you have it in Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago. Their business model would have been to bring product in from all over originally and sell it in the market with some level of local content, probably linked to their fresh stuff, so their meats and their vegetables and the like. But where they are constrained to turn their TT dollars or Bajan dollars into US dollars, they are very much interested in expanding how much of the products that are in PriceSmart are local. And once you start getting into the local stores, then you have the potential to use the PriceSmart network. So we have a soap manufacturer, for example, who is in PriceSmart and selling to Colombia, as an example, because our skin type and the like is not that far off from much of Latin America. So learning from what works and then trying to reverse engineer where we can and find the opportunity in the challenges would make sense. And just to echo again, two things that Gordon said, I really think the tech sector and agri-processing, given changing tastes, so jams, jellies, peppers, and the like in particular, or include, I guess, what the US, in the US market, they refer to as ethnic foods. These things have a lot of potential, and you have companies that are already sophisticated enough, as in business sophisticated, who have export units and people who are working on these things to expand our trade. And of course, there are backward linkages, right? So once a Grace Kennedy or Matooks or Citrus Growers Association or whoever are exporting, they will be using or trying to find local sources of production for their primary things. but then infusing technology in how we produce is really, really important. What we have to do is have a totally different mindset in the Caribbean from what we used to have regarding how we produce. We cannot compete on low cost production because that will move. What we have to do is move up the value chain and make sure what we are producing is hard to replicate. At least how we are producing it is hard to replicate. And therefore we'd have longevity of the products in the market. So we can't look at farming in terms of acres. We have to look at farming in terms of output per small spaces. And how do we infuse technology in that? And I don't just mean greenhouses. Sometimes when you say that, people say, well, greenhouses and vertical production. It's not just that. It is actually using the technology to understand the conditions, the production, but also the demand based on where your supplies are and what you should be growing to meet the demand 6 weeks, 6 months from now, etc. And I think there's a lot of potential. If we get the TICs and the TIFAs and the government discussions going, and right, that's great. But if we don't, it need not stop us from expanding and enhancing trade with the US.
Thank you so much, Nirad, and a lot to unpack there. And I'm conscious of the time that we only have 7 minutes, but just to say that this has been a very fruitful discussion because we've talked about, I remember that we're talking about the fact that, you know, the trade between the Caribbean and the US is quite concentrated. It's skewed in favor of the US because they have a surplus with us. And what we're trying to accomplish is to see how is it that we could get greater engagement with the private sector in order to export more and to export in a more diversified suite of products. And so we talked about some of the promising sectors. We got some suggestions from the panelists in terms of some ways in which we could do this in terms of greater sharing of information, capacity building, sharing of experiences, the use of technology, licensing in the US, using licensing arrangements with companies in the US to make manufacturing a bit cheaper, etc. And so what I'll do now is that there are a couple questions in the Q&A, and in light of the time, I'll read them out and I'll get the panelists' reaction. So one of the first questions that I have seen was in terms of a company that was that wanted to provide. I'm trying to find it now. 1 second. I am not seeing it anymore. It disappeared. But how can a service provider for globalization tech in the US support the MSMEs? I see Vashti had given a response. I'm just wondering if there's anyone who has seen it and wanted to respond to this. How can a service provider for globalization tech in the US support the SMEs? Is that something that you think would be promising? Okay, I think that would be better. 1 second. And then there was another question. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if I'm understanding the question correctly. It sounds like someone who has some form of tech solution is asking how they can connect with businesses here. So I guess it's a matter of literally answering that question. So what is the solution that you provide, and how do you connect with the people who might want it? So if it's something that, say, Vashti's members are interested in, or mine or Gordon's or Trisha's, then it's, you know, how do you get it through to the actual consumers? Because that looks like a question around a B2B arrangement.
Yeah.
If it's more developmental, meaning if it's an offer of support, then we'd all need to know what is the solution, and therefore how we could suggest it to members.
Mhm. And then another one is from David, and this is I like this question. Who's responsible for the lack of information and understanding in the region of CBI after 40 years and billions of US invested in regional CBI support? And I think it is a provocative question, but it's also a very necessary question, and it's one that I would be curious to hear your reactions to. Trisha, I don't know if you wanted to take this.
I think it goes back to, I mean, if I think of CBI, something I studied as a student at UE, when I got into business and private sector, I can't tell you that it's ever been raised at all in terms of a practical use. So after the theory of what happened, you know, back then, there really doesn't seem, it's certainly not something that we articulate. It's not part of our language. It's not part of our policy spaces and conversations. And, you know, it is there. And I think that's really why Andrea came full circle and the entire thrust of Andrea's report. We have these dormant, you know, arrangements that seem like great ideas at the time and are still very much useful, but are they up to date? You know, that are the constructs that were originated back, you know, 14, 20 years ago, 40 years ago, to David's point. Certainly we're not in the same economic space now. Neither in the Caribbean isn't. We've had since then a revision of the Treaty of Chaguaramas itself. You know, the US policy spaces have shifted. The sectors have shifted. We've had a pandemic. We've had maybe 3 or 4 recessions, you know, in that 40 years. It is difficult to say that, you know, the trading environment that was envisaged 40 years ago certainly is what we have, you know, today. Along the way, essentially, we've had, you know, it's just simply not been, you know, clearly a priority, you know. So, you know, if it is not a priority at CARICOM, it's not a priority for the Caribbean private sector associations. You know, we're at a very, very critical point, which is, look, are these constructs still relevant for doing trade with the US today? I think the answer generally is yes. Are they relevant in their current iteration? I think the answer is maybe, maybe not. And we do need to look at them, strip them off, you know, one by one, and say, look, if we were to renegotiate these arrangements today, what would they look like? What would they feel like? Okay. For example, we had the EPA that was negotiated, I think it was in 2008, I believe, all right? 14 years ago. Now, it's hard to think that the person sitting around the table thought it was a great idea to give Europe unrestricted and unfettered access, you know, duty-free access to the Caribbean market in 2023 and 2020, between 2023 and 2025. All right. Now, if you're a jurisdiction, a low manufacturing jurisdiction like Barbados, that seems like a huge existential threat at the moment, because simply, you know, the local manufacturing sector simply is not poised to react, respond, you know, and to protect itself. And therefore, just like we're querying the impact of the EPA on small, low manufacturing, low output jurisdictions like Barbados, you know, it's a similar conversation we need to have, you know, with all of these fairly aged, you know, constructs and agreements. Are they fit for purpose? You know, in a modern day, you know, Caribbean, you know, society, and in terms of what we're trying to do with the US, you know, is it a priority for the US? All right. You know, we've come out of the Ronald Reagan days, you know, where we were seen as an extension somewhat, you know, politically, you know, of the US. And it was definitely a huge talking point 40 years ago. You know, we've had several iterations of Caribbean, of US politics as well. So is it a priority for the US? Right? Is it a priority for CARICOM? I think these are the issues that I think Andrea's you know, paper has to speak to, you know, as well, because it was a priority. We need to Narad's point, clearly we need to, you know, we are doing business. Are we going to leverage these constructs to enhance the business? Can we catapult the business into the stratosphere if we were able to leverage more fit for purpose, more relevant, more updated, you know, trade and investment agreements? So I would leave that there. But I really do want to thank Andrea again. I don't think I'll contribute again after this point, for raising, you know, I think a fantastic, you know, a discussion. And I think we must have a follow-on because I don't think we can actually get it all sorted, the time that's been allocated. But thank you again for the opportunity to contribute. Alicia, Jan, Ramiz, thank you so much to my fellow panelists as well for their contributions.
Thank
If I
you
can
so much,
add 10
Trisha and
seconds.
Andrea, and then Gordon. Mhm.
Okay, just to say that the existing arrangements with the US were actually not negotiated. So that's my pet peeve, that it's, we talk about agreements, but it's actually, enacted by legislation. But very much to your broader point that the age and the fact that there was initially a lot of attention and investment directed, but no more. All of that speaks to the need for the TIFA, for the private sector to become engaged in the TIC, so that the ongoing implementation and mutations, etc., around the CBI, as well as opportunities to reflect the reality that the Caribbean is primarily services-based economies, primarily services exporters, that is excluded from CBI. All of those are reasons that the TIFA and the TIC mechanisms need to be engaged actively.
Thank you so much, Andrea and Gordon.
All right, to answer David's question, who's responsible for this, all the money wasted and all the time wasted at CBA? It's us collectively. I think we were given an opportunity because you're giving it on a silver platter. It's a unilateral trade agreement which benefits us, and you go to the table, and it is up to you now to therefore make it feasible and accessible and understood by everybody, and we did not do that. Likewise, when you once again, when you look at TIC and TIFA, you look at the models in which the other regions, Ecuador and Guatemala and so on, go in an organized fashion to make sure they understand what they want first, and they go to represent and negotiate. We are not doing that. We were given CBI. CBI is a great initiative, but then you have after you've been given, you don't expect them to make it work for you and show you how it works. And it is our job to understand how to educate and impart all of the understanding and knowledge to make it successful among our people. I'm glad now, I'm very happy that the CARICOM has finally incorporated and brought on board a private sector arm of its as part of its body. I think it's a critical statement in going forward that it understands the need for the private sector to participate directly at the highest level. The gauntlet has been handed down. It has been handed to the CPSO. I think the CPSO has gracefully accepted it, and it's over to them now to ensure that the next steps of responding to these sorts of initiatives to protect our private sector is done by them. So I look forward to participating and being part of that response. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. And I will give the other two panelists their concluding remarks, because I am aware that we're over time, and I know you're very busy people. So I would go to Vashti and then Nirad, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure. Thanks, Alicia. My priority, what I would like to see is that collectively, in terms of the private sector bodies that represent the services sector, we need to get our act in order. We need to work together. The mechanism that is the CNSC needs to be structured if we are to represent collectively the services sector in the region. So that's the top priority for me.
Thank you very much, Vashti and Nirad.
I just want to thank the SRC for the work that it's doing to not only keep the policy discussion alive, but to widen it beyond just academia. And I congratulate Dr. Remy, whom I knew in another life many moons ago, and the team, Alicia, all of you as well. Andrea, I think that the paper really outlines the issues and points some directional ways forward. And clearly, we all have some more work to do to take advantage of the recommendations. I know we didn't get to the ABD, and you asked us about it. It is a vehicle. How useful it is or not is for debate. And I think one of the challenges that we as a private sector have to face is how do we balance operational stability of the organization, serving the members, and then having the capacity to effectively advocate, which is effectively what will need to happen through the ADB if we were to engage meaningfully in that process. And those are things that I think many of us are still trying to come to terms with. But through greater collaboration that is multi-sectoral, I think we are more and more likely to achieve useful and tangible results. So again, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing and participating in more of your activities as we go forward.
Thank you so much, Nirad. And it's my pleasant task to wrap up and thank everyone, chief of which would be my distinguished panelists, Ms. Andrea Ewart, Ms. Vashti Goyadeen, Mr. Nirad Terari, Mr. Gordon Charles, Mrs. Trisha Tanis. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to participate in this initiative. And that's one of the things that we really promote at the SRC, bridging the link between academia and policy and academia, and in your case, the private sector, in order to promote trade for development. And thank you as well to you, our audience. I know we're a bit over time, but thank you for staying with us and for your questions and comments throughout this discussion. And thank you, of course, to the SRC team for all of the support, to my director, Dr. Jani Remy, who spearheaded this. Thank you so much. And to you, the audience, all of you who came out, thank you so much for spending this afternoon with us. And we do look forward to you joining us for other SRC discussions. Have a great evening, everyone, and thank you again. And to the IT team, thank you. Bye.